Jurors in the Jason Jones murder trial have ended their first day of deliberations. They're spending the night sequestered in a local motel room.
And so far, they have spent just over 5 hours debating whether to find Jones guilty of 4 counts of first-degree murder and 2 counts of first-degree arson, guilty of lesser charges, or not guilty on some or all counts. Jones is accused of shooting and killing Michelle Ebling and Jean, Janet, and Dana Twyford, and then setting their 2 homes on fire on August 4th, 2022 in Laurel, Nebraska. Jones is facing 4 counts of first-degree murder and 4 counts of use of a weapon to commit a felony, as well as 2 counts of first-degree arson. The state spent 10 days presenting evidence to show Jones' premeditation and planning of the crimes. Some of the evidence entered included receipts for the purchase of 2 gas cans and a backpack, which were used allegedly in those crimes. The receipts found inside a bag on Michelle Ebling's kitchen table. The state says they've proved beyond a reasonable doubt that Jason Jones is guilty of the charges he faces.
Not only did Jason Jones shoot Jean from the doorway, he walks into the bedroom and he fires 1, 2, 3 times. Those steps, walking into that bedroom to shoot Janet and pulling that trigger 1, 2, 3 times shows his intent was to kill her.
There are 3 charges the defense is strongly contesting. The first being the first-degree murder charge involving victim Michelle Ebling. Now, the defense says Jason Jones didn't kill her. His wife, Carrie Jones, did. The defense also says he can't be guilty of arson in the first degree because the 4 victims were already dead.
What do you need for first-degree arson? A live person in the house when the fire started. Think about that. You need a live person in the house when that fire is started. Start asking yourselves, the Twyfords were dead, and Ms. Evelyn was dead when those fires were started. They were dead. There is zero dispute about that.
Each of the 4 victims were found to have died before the fires were set, and soot was not found in their airways. The state says Jones had no way of knowing each victim was dead when he set the fires. Jones hasn't appeared at this trial because of ongoing issues with burns he suffered. The jury will resume deliberations at 9 a.m. tomorrow morning.